we have a lot of species that exist only here. So there is a pretty high level of biodiversity that's either only in Florida or only in the southeastern U.S. that is under threat. My message there is, if you look at, and I just drove out here through those residential areas, it's trees, grass with a few landscape shrubs against the house. There's no mid-canopy.
Right. It's the kind of research that will move industries and that will lead to change.
I think we should be aware that biodiversity is under threat from human development and expansion, and then we should use that knowledge as a prompt for us to do something about it.
When we start viewing our urban landscapes as part of our healthcare system, it really shifts kind of the value paradigm.
Here we are.
Outside?
Yep, outside.
I figure we could start with kind of just an open question. Why is the study of ecology important?
Well, that's a very good question. And ecology really emerged in the early 20th century out of the tradition of natural history. Charles Darwin was a natural historian. People describing nature, naming things. Linnaeus named things. Went around the world and collected all the species and put names on them. And then people started to look at how all these things interacted. You had things like forestry, and people were managing ecosystems, so there was a need to understand how they operated. And then the scientific field of ecology started to emerge when people really started to acquire more of that history and knowledge, and then tried to understand, well, what is behind the patterns we see in nature. And so a lot of the early 20th century ecology was really about describing things like communities. How do communities develop through time? Are they stable? Do they change? A lot of the plant ecologists really focused on that. And then as you got into later in the 60s and whatnot, where the atomic communities were developing and the atomic science, there's a lot of tools that were developed, statistical tools that were being developed that enabled ecologists to become more experimental. And once that happened, then ecologists started to set up big experiments so they could actually have more controlled testing of their theories about how ecological systems worked. And that included very, very large experiments, which are still a big part of how ecology is operating right now. People still do big experiments, so it's become more experimental. And then through time, theories have been developed and tested, and as with any science, there are still a lot of questions. There's still, I would say, some contested issues in ecology about how well we understand certain things. But we've certainly developed our understanding to the point where anything related to conservation, restoration, issues we're concerned about globally, like biodiversity loss, but even climate change. All of those things do require an application of everything we've learned about how nature works. And ecology has made a big contribution to that, especially from the viewpoint of animals, plants, ecosystems. So it's been fascinating to see how ecology has developed over the years. And then there have been ecologists along the way who have made major contributions to how we think about our relationship with nature, what is our appropriate relationship that we should have, can we apply our theories to how we manage ecosystems and all that sort of a thing.
So how is ecology different than some of the other natural sciences that seek to understand how nature works, for example, biology or physics?
Yeah, well, it's really a branch of biology. So ecology is a branch of biology. And if you look at how a lot of biology departments developed over time, a lot of biology departments originally would have had, maybe it would have medically oriented people who were doing like bacteriology and microbiology, but it was a lot of the animal, you had departments of zoology and botany. When I went to Ohio State, I was in an old building that was built back in the early 20th century, or 1920s or whatever, and it was called the Botany and Zoology Building. So everybody had a department of botany, everybody had a department of zoology, you had your animal specialists, your plant specialists. Then ecology emerged as this more integrative field, where it's not that you understood something about animals, you had a specialty. Now you could study whole systems, you studied how things interacted with one another. And so that's just kind of a sub-discipline of biology that developed into something that was more focused on the patterns and processes of nature than just simply classification of organisms and understanding how individual organisms behaved. And so it has drawn, though, parts of, and as that development happened, it went all the way from understanding populations, where you would be interested, like let's say an endangered species, you're interested in understanding, its dynamics, its demography, and that sort of a thing. So all the way from understanding individual populations, and even there's ecophysiology, understanding like the physiology of organisms, all the way to communities, and then up to whole ecosystems. So ecosystem ecology developed during that kind of atomic period, where let's manipulate whole ecosystems. And so it differs from the other sciences in that it works at those different scales and focuses on those interactions. And then more so recently, ecology, agroecology and urban ecology, areas I've been interested in, they actually start to work with the social sciences, because a lot of the issues that we deal with in ecology have to deal with how humans are manipulating systems, and you have to understand what drives human behavior, how we make policy, and those kinds of things. So you see ecology more on the side of the bigger scale, more towards the social science aspect, as opposed to maybe the more reductionist biology, where we're looking at genetics and things like that.
Trying to isolate and understand things in individual units, as opposed to looking at broader systems,
Yeah.
and how they are related. There's a lot more complexity, it seems, in understanding large systems and communities, as opposed to maybe trying to understand the functioning of an organ in a certain species.
Yes, it's a very different level of science, and it's a very different set of tools that you need to use, and application of different kinds of theories, and even the mathematics that you have to use to do it. So yeah, and that's what, ecology, a lot of people don't understand what ecology is, because ecology also gets mixed up with environment and environmentalism. But as a field, it's a pretty strong field. So you did see, I was talking about how botany and zoology developed, and then as biology became more complex, because you also then had Watson and Crick and discovering DNA, and now genetics is this huge science. A lot of campuses of like big state schools, let's take for an example, ecology would break off as its own thing. So you would have development of departments of ecology and the environment, for example, that would break off from the rest of the biological sciences. And whether a big university has done that depends on its structure and it's how it's put together. But Ohio State did that, places like Minnesota. And then some programs don't even have, graduate programs in ecology. They have a lot of ecologists that are spread out among the biological
disciplines.
Sciences. Yeah.
Because it's fundamentally an integrative
Yes.
approach. So you're drawing on a lot of different disciplines,
Yes.
Including mathematics.
That's a big thing. And now, I'm getting older, but now a lot of the folks, it's amazing, you just can't imagine, a lot of the folks in ecology are taking advantage of what we all understand as big data. And I'm not just talking about artificial intelligence, which is obviously part of that, but big data, the idea that there's huge amounts of data out there available in the world, and can we take advantage of those big data sets to ask questions on scales we've never asked before. And so one of my colleagues, for example, at UCF, Dave Jenkins, that's exactly what he does. He's gone out, iNaturalist, I'm sure, are you familiar
Yes.
with iNaturalist? Well, there are some of those, and I'll just, not just iNaturalist, but a lot of these observational records of where organisms are found. People making an observation and uploading it, and it's got a geographic reference to it, so you know exactly on the earth where you are and what organism it was. A lot of that goes in this global biodiversity information system, GBIF, and anybody can download those data. So Dave has asked questions like, and he does this with one of his graduate classes, he'll ask a question like, have the average range of different groups of organisms shifted over the past 30 years, and is that related to climate change? So the students get all the data on birds, someone else gets all the data on insects, someone goes and gets reptiles, and he runs these models, with this statistical environment that take 24 hours to run on his computer, and then the next day he has this output that you just can't imagine ever having worked on that much data at that scale 30 years ago. So then you can ask questions at that scale and come up with these patterns. So we're entering a new phase with this big data.
Yeah, that's exciting in all walks of life. But I can see where, in trying to understand the natural world, which is so rich and complex and vast, it's particularly useful.
Yeah.
You've been talking about patterns, kind of, that seems to be a key to understanding ecological systems. What is a pattern in nature, and what are we looking for?
What is a pattern in nature? So like some of the early people, and a lot of it happened like during the Dust Bowl era, a lot of people were working on describing plant communities. And they actually, back in the 40s and 50s and 30s were using what we would look at now as kind of elemental statistical tools in developing new approaches. And the Germans actually were doing this for years, everyone recognized out in nature, you walk into a forest, you go into a prairie, that you tend to see associations of species together. Here we are, we're in an oak hammock, there's the beautyberry. Different communities, and they also would see these gradations. Well, this one seems to have a lot of oak, and this one seems to have more, maples in it. And so people tried to describe those patterns, like can we describe communities, and then can we look at how communities progress over time. So there's this idea of a succession that all communities, if you let them alone, will develop to this climax state, right? These are very elemental patterns, examinations in ecology. And so those were understanding those patterns and what controlled them. It was a very early part of ecology. And now it's more about change, because at that time people were looking at these as static patterns that would appear in nature based on a given set of conditions. And when the Dust Bowl came in, some of the people working in the prairies out in the Midwest realized that, all my conceptions about how these communities fit together have been changed. Because after that, the communities changed, some of them completely morphed into something else. So you've got this whole development of an idea more recently that, yes, there are patterns that exist in nature, but what we call stability is really there's a constant change in systems. We have these, what people will call, you hear referred to as dynamic equilibria, and there's still controversy over what those kind of things mean, but you do get these kind of equilibrium states, but that the states are really always changing. And what's really bringing that to the fore now is climate change, because even if we say we have this set of associations now, we know that as climate change comes in Florida, for example, we're going to get more tropical species from the south. They're going to move up into central Florida, and those communities will change. We're in an interesting place here because temperate and tropical there's a radical shift in the plant palette when you move from zone 10 to zone 9.
Yes, exactly. And that seems the line of that demarcation is moving north.
It's moving north, kind of right where we are, which is exciting in a lot of ways. It's inevitable, and so those patterns are important. And then it becomes very important when you think about environmental policies, because there's a lot of emphasis on, we want to restore ecosystems, so there's a damaged ecosystem, let's fix it. So there's a whole, science of restoration ecology. Let's use what we understand about nature to get the patterns we want. And that's proven to be a very challenging thing. Applying ecological principles to get to an end goal you want and that you desire based on what we know can be quite challenging. And in fact, when you do restoration,
that it would be very frustrating.
Yeah.
You're describing so many dynamics and so much complexity, and how these ecosystems, evolve over time, how they are being impacted by human activity, by changes in climate, by, I'm certain, just an infinite number of internal dynamics. So to be able to control something like that is almost, it seems like it would be very, very frustrating.
Yeah.
To get to a level of I guess, control. But maybe that's not what we're seeking in ecology. Is there maybe a different way to think about our, the purpose of mastering this discipline, if not to control, the ecology that surrounds us? What is our role as human beings? Because we are part of the system.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that does boil down to, really, in a sense, a set of values. What do people value, and what do they want? I always like to point out that science can inform what we do. It can inform our policies, but a lot of what we do is going to be really driven by our values, and then it comes down to what do people value. And then you get into things like Aldo Leopold and the land ethic. Aldo Leopold was a wildlife biologist and kind of an ecologist towards the end of his career, who was trying to come up with this idea of the land ethic, where, we need to extend our ethics so that we include the biotic community that we're part of, not to exclude humans, but we need to treat nature and the biotic community ethically. That's not something that is necessarily a conclusion you would make just based on what we know about nature. It's more of a statement of value and what we should be. It's got more of a should in it. And so, some ecologists like to avoid that kind of should aspect of things and just try to be more, let's call it value-free, and that's hard to really be. But when it comes to how you apply things and where your goals are, it comes down to values. But if you think of just think of Florida, any issue, and a good one to think about is like water pollution, Indian River Lagoon, Lake Okeechobee. We have these very dysfunctional ecological systems that we know we created the dysfunction through nutrient runoff and changing the drainage and building homes with septic systems on the edge of the estuary. And so people, collectively, it's obvious that people want the problem, if not fixed, recognize it as a problem, and we're willing to, as a community, both in that regional area and throughout the state, just using the Indian River Lagoon as an example, to improve it, to make it better, recognizing that we've kind of made it a mess and wanting to invest a lot of resources into making it better because we value what that estuary provided or can provide in a more natural, balanced state that it was in before we changed it. So I think those are the things that really drive, our decisions at that level. And then from the biodiversity aspect, and a lot of, like what Outside touches upon, is can we get more of our nature and biodiversity in the spaces where we live, because we change those so much. And that also comes back to, well, what do people value? And can you affect what they value by educating them? And so that's, I guess, my viewpoint on that.
I see that as you study ecology, you inevitably are going to come into contact with the role of human societies on the ecosystems themselves.
Yes.
There's probably very few ecosystems that you can study anymore that aren't impacted by human activity.
Yeah.
And so we're studying something of which we are also a part of. Like, we are part of the system that we're trying to understand.
Yes. And that's another advance that really happened in my lifetime, I would say. So let's just say over the past 50 years, that ecologists, even when I started out back in the 80s, as a grad student and undergrad, mostly a lot of the work up to that point, and ecologists in general, were people who went and found untrammeled nature somewhere and studied it. They found the most remote wilderness forest, or they found a remnant prairie, and then it really started to change. Number one, because the planet was changing so much, but ecologists also started to realize, well, we can't just be going off and finding, wilderness areas when the world is less and less of that, and we still have ecological systems everywhere. So more ecologists started to turn their attention towards these other human-dominated systems. And that's where you had the emergence of, like I was talking about earlier, agroecology. Applied ecology became a big thing, which is how do we apply ecology to like real-world problems. Urban ecology is another one that came out, that ecologists became a different breed, because then, in the old days, there was more the naturalists going out and finding wild nature. And anymore, a large part of it is including people and inclusive of people. And not just inclusive of people affecting the environment and working in human-dominated landscapes, but also considering different cultural perspectives, indigenous knowledge, and these other kinds of things that have, historically weren't considered.
Yeah. You were talking about values and ethics and in terms of our understanding of human relationships to ecology, and we should probably talk more about that. But it seems to me that even before values and ethics, there may be an issue of awareness, like a basic lack of awareness that we are part of an ecological system, that ecological system is fundamental or foundational to our well-being, our health, and our wealth.
Yes.
There's a kind of a dissociation in the culture that that we are not ecology, or that ecology is not something that people are aware of.
Yes, that's very true. I think you mentioned it before, and I always forget the name of this book, the one about No Child.
Last Child in the Woods.
Last Child in the Woods. Last Child in the Woods. So there is that phenomenon. At the same time, I think a lot more people, and Outside obviously is an example of that, and what the Outside collab has been involved in, and Doug Tallamy and folks. There's definitely a upswell of interest among some people in connecting with nature and bringing nature back to our lives at the same time that we have to admit we're more disconnected. The amount of screen time that teenagers and young kids have today, you know, I ran around in the woods as a kid. And that screen time takes you away from nature. We live in more artificial environments. You think of like so many people live in HOAs that have these very artificial landscapes. So I do think there's a deficit of understanding. Fewer kids fish, fewer kids hunt, you know, fewer kids run out and catch fireflies, things that, so there's a populace of people that don't understand or have been more disconnected from nature. I think maybe that could create a yearning as they become more aware that they want to be more connected, and I think we see that happening with a lot of movements around the country right now and around the world really. But yeah, it's a challenge to think about the awareness. When you're not immersed in nature, you become removed from it, and I think as we become more urbanized, we become more removed, and that's one of the reasons I'm interested in urban ecology, because that's where the people are, that's where we need to,
that's where the action's at.
that's where we need to connect them to nature.
Because I think if you're removed and disconnected from nature, it's unlikely that you're really going to value it.
Yes.
That you can incorporate that into your ethics.
Yes.
And if I personally believe, and this is just a personal belief, that we do need to incorporate nature and ecology into our ethics so that we can be good stewards of the ecology that sustains us. And in the absence of that, we run the risk of leading to decision making that could lead to the degradation of our ecology and eventually the collapse of our ecology, which is a real threat to human societies.
It is, and it's happening. We see it happening, and it's at the same time we, you know, and people are rightly concerned. And sometimes I think there's a voice of alarmism in it. I think it's justified, you know, when you think about biodiversity loss and things like that. But you're also really witnessing how resilient Earth systems are. We may have changes that we can't reverse that are going to be sad. Just think of the coral reefs and things like that. That we've damaged on the globe, but you know, there's deep coral reefs, there's other coral in the world. Coral may survive, maybe it won't. So we are seeing at the same time that we're kind of damaging the earth, there is emerging a picture also of its resilience and its ability to recover if we set it up to recover and encourage it to recover. I think I was mentioning earlier about the restoration. The other thing's great about today is there's so much published literature that a lot of scientists will go in and look at all the published literature, and they'll actually go in and take the data out of published papers, and they have a whole set of criteria so that they're making sure it's comparable, and then they do what's called a meta-analysis, where they don't just analyze their data, they look at people who have already analyzed data. And so some really interesting things are emerging from that, but one of them was somebody said, let's compare this instances where we really take an active role in restoration, trying to apply our theories, versus we just let it go. We said, okay, let it recover. We took off the stressor, and they found that really just letting systems recover is about as effective as going in and spending a lot of money on trying to
do nothing.
Yeah, doing nothing is, in some instances, in their comparison of all these data, leads to pretty good outcomes too, which is just this confirmation that if you let nature recover, it will recover.
When we're all gone, everything will be fine. But in an urban system, you don't have the option of doing that because you can't just leave it alone.
That's right.
There are people there.
It has to be constantly managed.
So that's where maybe it becomes more of a really intentional and strategic management approach.
Yeah, there you have to decide how you're going to let it go. And this is something that you live in a house, I'm sure, in a neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood, an HOA, and it's just, and I'm, you know, being a student of nature, it's just fascinating to me to watch what people do and what's happening, and realizing that, you know, most people don't have a lot of time to think about it, like with the expertise level, so they hire a company to manage their lawn. And then they may or may not have the interest, but you know, they like the pretty flowers, they probably don't mind having the birds in the yard and they like that, but maybe they don't give it a lot of thought. And then the differences you can have, you know, between two yards that are right next to each other. And the impact that you can have in those spaces, if you do things intentionally, is actually quite large and very easy to accomplish. And that's where it's somewhat frustrating to see when it's not being applied and we're not taking what we know to make these spaces better.
You're talking about the residential landscape.
I'm talking about the residential landscape.
The American lawn.
The American lawn, which is the main, that form of development is one of the fastest growing in the world, the suburban development, not just in the US, but in China and other parts of the world. It's the fastest growing, even though it's still a relatively small footprint when you think of agriculture and those other things. But that's an opportunity to make these connections and to incorporate more of ecology in how we manage our spaces. And it's very similar to me because I was in the agroecology field and sustainable agriculture. There's just so many similarities. It has to, and you talked about the need in your previous podcast about you have to have uniformity if you're a nursery producer. You've got to be able to get the product that matches, that can get out there. But then the lawn and the lawns that people build and construct are just built around a uniformity that, to me, it's more like a farm field. It's a monoculture. It's a monoculture, and it's a monoculture landscape bed, and it's a monoculture lawn, which means it's got high input of, for the most obvious examples, fertilizer, herbicide, fungicide, pesticide. Any neighbor of mine that's got the little sign they put in the yard, we just sprayed. I know that they 4 times a year are spraying nicotinoid insecticides, they're spraying fungicides, they're putting out liquid fertilizer. That to me is like the same issues we had in agriculture where you got this high input,
toxic.
And it's high input.
It's high input, so it's expensive.
Expensive, and water on top of it.
And then the water, and then the labor to mow it, and the carbon to run the tractors. But I think people understand a little bit that there's a lot of water going out, and there's a lot of maybe a lot of labor, but I don't think they realize what that little sign means. Like, this yard was just sprayed. Like, you mentioned neonicotinoids.
Yeah.
Like,
neonics,
this is super toxic stuff.
Super toxic stuff.
Extremely carcinogenic.
And they could use more non-toxic ones, but I even talked to a person, because we were doing a study where we kind of want to know it, and Pierce may get this information for the the neighborhoods we're working in, and you may have some of it yourself, but imidacloprid is the most toxic of the neonics, and it's generally involved. This one guy said, that's our major ingredient. It's a very toxic. And then if I see a dead bumblebee on the sidewalk, I don't know, did it die of old age or did it encounter the neonics? I don't know. But that's just, why are we toxifying? I mean, we've toxified our agricultural systems, which are more toxic now than they were in the 90s because of neonics. And now we're doing it to our neighborhoods. Like, why are we putting out
It's a lot of chemical exposure.
It's a lot of chemical exposure. And I think people think more about the water and all those kind of things. People don't think about enough, I think, about the unnecessary toxins. Because I've owned 3 homes in 2 different climate zones in Florida. All of them in some sort of HOA. I've never put pesticides out other than treating fire ant nests. Rarely used herbicide. And no one's ever said anything about my yard. I use mostly organic. It's possible.
It's not necessary if you know what you're doing.
If you know what you're doing,
and you have the techniques. But unfortunately, the predominant paradigm, and again, people don't put a lot of thought into the design of their yard or the management of their yard. I think it's usually just kind of an accepted status quo.
Yeah,
they inherit it from the builder. It's just the norm. But when you start peeling back the actual cost, the economic cost, but also the environmental cost, and maybe more importantly, the human health cost.
Oh yeah.
They're very high, and if we just analyze it a little bit, it certainly would stir you to action. It stirs me to action to want to think of a new way to approach that. Irrigated turfgrass, if you compare it to all other crops in the United States, is the largest irrigated crop in the United States by acreage.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
More so than corn and soy and wheat. And it's just a massive land area that is being dedicated to this particular, we'll call it an ecosystem.
Yes.
And it's a shame, because if we had an alternative approach, we could leverage all that land, which is in private and public hands, but it's not necessarily needs to be conserved, doesn't have to be purchased by the state, or it could be in your neighborhood, it could be around your home. That land could start serving really important functions to support life human life, but also biodiversity
Yeah.
generally, right?
Absolutely.
Can you provide a little historical and cultural context on the American lawn? Like, where does this idea come from?
Well, I'm not 100% sure. I've read a couple of books about that. Certainly kind of the pastoral, people like pastoral landscapes, which is the mowed lawn and the open spaces and the long vistas where they can see across the lawn. The lawn opens things up. It makes everything very visible. Even on campus right now, our VP of facilities, who's over landscape now, it's kind of the thing he's really pushing for. So we just have trees and grass, and then you have landscapes up against the building. So it's a lot of it has to do with these viewscapes that we create across the lawn. And then the lawn also it's also kind of associated with this idea of repose. You put your chairs out on the lawn. You can play badminton, or have your kids playing and running across it. So that's I think part of what drives the lawn aspect is that it's this open, green, beautiful, welcoming, and also very accessible, and you can interact with it in a lot of different ways. I think that just drove the lawn, and then, as you've pointed out, it's really become an industry. It wasn't an industry 50 years ago like it is today. It's really become an industry, and so the turf, as you know, the turf scientists at these land-grant universities like UF and Ohio State, where I went to school, turf was the biggest undergraduate major in agriculture. It's a huge thing, and that's why I'm always very sensitive about, well, if we want to be critical of turf, we have to give an alternative that still has turf in it. So I think there are alternatives to what we would call the turf, the open landscape. And you're doing work here, obviously at Cherry Lake, making tremendous progress on developing alternative ground covers, for example. The idea of mixed turf, which if you go into most old neighborhoods in Tampa or Orlando with the big trees and whatnot, you find out the turf is now whatever is growing and whatever they're mowing. They're not maintaining St. Augustine like they were when they built the houses 40 years ago, in some cases. So this idea that you can have more diverse assemblages of species in the turf, not just that look green and decent, but also are providing pollinator resources for the little flowering things in your turf, probably food resources for some of the little butterflies whose little caterpillars eat those little plants. Turf could be different, and I think the turf industry feels kind of threatened about some of these alternatives, but having alternative turf just opens up a new opportunity to support that system.
Yeah, it's still an industry.
Yes.
We still have to landscape our urban communities. We still need to cover the ground with plants. We're just suggesting that there might be different plants that could be used, and more importantly, combinations of plant species
Yes.
that could be used. From a management perspective, when you look at the cost of maintaining or managing a landscape system or a turf grass system, like we mentioned, there are a lot of inputs and costs that go into that, the chemicals and the labor and the water and so forth. I've noticed that the more diverse the system is, the more self-sustaining it is. The more resilient it is to disruption and changes in conditions, and therefore the less cost you have to maintain it.
Yes, true. And that in itself poses some problems, because there are people profiting off the costs that would want you to spend that money. But you're absolutely right. And I'm an ecologist, so I could take you on a little tour of my yard, and we could have a half an hour discussion of all the little corners of my yard, and why those plants are there and not over there. And because even in a little postage stamp yard, if you got trees in any kind of slope, there's little variation and differences, and certain plants do better in these little spots than over there on the other side of the yard. So even on a small yard, and the work they did up at UF, Basil's Ian Ioannidis referred to that, where they just looked at, like, I can't remember, it was 60 feet by 60 feet, and they found 70 species or something in the turf.
And it just looks like turf.
It looks like turf.
Yeah.
Nobody cares. Nobody cares about my yard.
If you start looking a little bit more closely, you're going to discover there's clovers and there's frog fruit and there's some legumes.
Yeah. And my yard's like that, where it looks green, but if you went up and looked, there's a lot of diversity in here, as opposed to some of my neighbors who have just grass because they're doing the herbicide treatments with the chemical companies. But also the water, I'm always amazed, because I really do, and I do have a tree in my front yard in shade, but I'm probably down to 15 inches a year max, I'm sure, because I barely irrigate in my yard. And once the summer hits, I just turn the system off unless we were to go into extended drought. And I've got neighbors that click it on 2 days a week, every week.
Yeah.
And when I do kick it on, I see the bill that comes the next week. I'm like, how are these? They must be spending
Hundreds.
a couple $100 a month that I'm not spending on water that's not leading to a better outcome in terms of like what it looks like. It's interesting to think about.
I think we have to embrace the idea that we can have lower cost landscapes, and that it's not a threat to industry. The way I look at it, when somebody hires you to maintain their lawn, they're not hiring you to mow the grass and blow and to put out chemicals. They're hiring you to maintain the lawn to a certain functional and aesthetic standard.
Yes.
So if you were able to do that without all the inputs, you should be able to get the same price from the customer, but not have all of these costs. So
exactly.
My pitch to commercial landscape companies is that this approach is actually a way to build back margins, which have been devastated in the landscape maintenance industry.
Yeah.
In anyways, I mean, there's very little margins left.
Yeah.
Because we have all these high input costs.
Yeah, that's so true.
Well, let's get back to ecology.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to ask you about the creepy crawlies.
Yeah.
So why are insects and pollinators important?
Yeah, insects and pollinators. Yeah. Well, pollinators are so key because they are important in the transmission of the fertile aspects of plants and reproduction. All these beauty berries out here got pollinated. A lot of plants can self, they don't need them, but they obviously are important for plant productivity, which means they affect fruit set and things like that. That's the main thing, that they do that. They also then are involved in all kinds of other relationships with other organisms, and that's where you get kind of to the interdependence. And I think any group you look at, and pollinators I think are key because they are attracted to flowers. People like flowers. They include things like the honeybee and bumblebee, which people have very positive views of in general. A lot of people are scared of bees, but pollinators are a friendly, small organism that people can rally around, which is why you have so much going on with pollinators. But to me, you could pick any group. I have another student working on ground beetles, and that group tells you just as much. They're just as important to so many different phenomena and processes that are going on in the system, and the structure of their communities tells you so much about what's going on. But for pollinators, what it really tells you is the level of diversity that you can support in a landscape, because so many of them are involved with special relationships with different floral types. So if you introduce more different floral types, small plants with very small tiny flowers that bloom at certain times of year versus big showy flowers, we know that has a big impact. We have a good understanding of which pollinators are attracted to which kinds of flowers. And a lot of what we've done to the landscape is to remove a lot of more of these specialty native flowers that would have been supporting pollinators across the entire landscape that now is really only happening in our natural areas. So for a lot of the small little solitary bees, which make up by far and away the most important pollinators group, they don't fly, they only go 200 feet or 300 feet. They've got to have that resource there somewhere that they can use. So I think people got excited about pollinators because Save the Bees, honeybees started to experience a lot of issues. That got people excited about that. But then the whole issue of pollinators and their role in the system is just very important from a perspective of plant reproduction and fruit production and biodiversity. They're also involved in these other interactions, like I said, that are leading to all kinds of interdependencies and interesting biological interactions, like the flower wasps that are preying on larvae of scarab beetles in the soil when they're babies. That's where they lay their eggs. That's a whole nother ecological function that group provides, which is like a pest control function that people wouldn't normally think of a pollinator being involved in. And then some of the pollinators are predators, the wasps. They're playing a very important role in killing caterpillars and controlling plant pests. And then the bees are extremely diverse, and they also feed a lot of other organisms. Wherever you have a beehive or if you see a lot of pollinators, you see the predators of the pollinators. dragonflies and things like that, and those dragonflies are being eaten by swallows and birds and things like that. So we don't normally think of the pollinators as being a base of a food chain, but in fact they are involved in predator-prey interactions and things like that as well. So it's a very diverse group. It's very important in its interaction with plants, which makes them a very interesting group because they do have this set interaction with plants that we can kind of identify, and they can just tell us a lot about the system. And it's also very easy to put stuff in your yard when we talk about urban ecology. Provided you have a source population, it's very easy to put things and flowers that aren't normally grown typically in a yard that will attract and support pollinators that aren't typically supported in a suburban lawn. That's the other thing. You can get and bring in species and support species that aren't supported by your typical landscape plants. So yeah, that's why it's just been, it's been fun working with them. I'm new to pollinator ecology, but I kind of started out in biology way long time ago. My interest was entomology and plant-insect interactions, not pollinators, but just plant herbivores and plants. And then late career I've come back and it's another form of plant-insect interaction, which is the pollinator. That's what I really like about it. It's got the insect part and the plant part, and those are just my interests. So
it's almost like magic, because you you bring in a new native plant,
yeah,
to your yard or wherever, your farm, that you didn't have there before.
Yeah.
And that same day,
yeah,
the very same day,
yeah, it's amazing.
this new pollinator or butterfly will show up.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they find them,
where they're coming from,
but it's you could set your clock to it.
It is amazing. I think there are probably some limitations, where some bumblebees won't be there because they need to be near natural areas. But it's amazing. Just about anywhere you pop these plants down, you get somebody shows up that you didn't expect to be there. And it's predictable in some cases. This flower is going to attract these kinds of things, and that's where some of the small wasps and whatnot. I don't know if you ever heard of Lara bicolor, but Lara bicolor is a wasp that was brought in specifically to this country. It's not native to North America. It was brought in specifically to control mole crickets. And everybody knows that what they need is spermacoa, which is false buttonweed or buttonweed. And I planted some buttonweed in our garden. Sure enough, Lara bicolor showed up. But when I was working down at Sunbridge, what I noted, and Lara bicolor is very small little white flowers. I saw a lot of Lara bicolor on the holly trees, which have the small little white flowers.
Dahoon hollies?
It was the Dahoon hollies. I saw a lot of them down in Sunbridge. I saw a lot of those. So that just is, the organism that you want to control your mole crickets, but you got to have the flowers for the adults to feed on the flowers. And they were even, you can look up in IFAS, they even recommend planting buttonweed if you want to get these wasps to exist in your landscape. But it's so true, and I know you're probably growing wild coffee, and I do that too, and it blooms in the spring, and it's a wonderful plant. And I'm always trying to mess around with. I'd like to mess more with the shrubs than my lawn, just because in an HOA, it's fairly easy to do something with your shrubs. And I planted the velvet leaf.
Is it the Bahama coffee?
The Bahama coffee in my yard, and it's completely different because it blooms all summer long. So it's still blooming. It started blooming in June or May. It blooms all year, and I see at least 8 or 9 species of pollinator every time I go out. So that's just like one of my new favorite, one plant that supports a lot of diversity for a long time that I kind of didn't know, because I always knew wild coffee was good. It's a great plant, but it blooms for two weeks. And this one blooms throughout the season. So you discover there was all this, interesting interactions we could find and identify these plants that really can bring in different kinds of pollinators. But that's the other thing I like about them. They are ubiquitous. So in an urban system, you can have an impact. People can see, you can educate and raise awareness with pollinators, which is great. Birds are another group that holds true for, which Mark Hofstadter's worked a lot on. So these are the kinds of things we can have, in our backyards.
Yeah, and you actually have done some of the work with your graduate students to map these plant-pollinator relationships.
Yes.
In fact, we've learned new things as a result of that effort to map which species of pollinators are visiting which plants.
Yes, and pollinator, there's a lot of pollinator people right now because it's such a big thing. A lot of people working in pollination. More of that information is being gathered, and that's another thing where I think, in 10 or 15 years, we should have not just an understanding of like if you get one of those pollinator books, like this will help your bees, these plants are great for bees, and these bees come, but I think it'll be even more detailed. Like this plant will support these 5 different,
Right.
species really strongly, because we're going to start publishing and getting these data out there in the literature, where we really will develop. It won't be like cookbook, but you will know, and I think we're getting to know more, not just what general groups they support, but in specific regions, which species of pollinator are going to be really attracted by this plant that you're planting.
That's really,
Yeah.
that's really encouraging.
Another great meta-analysis that came out this year, I was talking about the importance of these meta-analysis. They did global, because a lot of people in urban areas, including all the major urban ecology groups in America and China and everywhere else, birds are a real key. There's a lot of interest. People love birds, as you know. They're crazy for birds. Birds live in suburban areas. You have birds in your yard. And they showed that something I know intuitively, and maybe you might think of, that the key thing that really helps bird diversity is the mid-canopy layer. So think of a small tree, like a stopper that you let grow into a tree, or just a big fire. But those mid-canopy is key. And if you think about it, if you go into a lot of forests, there's the upper canopy, there's the mid canopy. That mid canopy is key. And now that we know that, that could be an emphasis in how we design landscapes. Let's make sure we have small mid canopy. And we do. In Florida, we have,
There's a lot of great trees for that.
a lot of the introduced things are, you'd have to say crepe myrtle, you'd have to say
Well, showstopper,
Japanese
Simpson
privet,
stopper.
even the introduced ones are serving that function.
They're serving that.
but-
So is beautyberry? Would that be?
Beautyberry might. It's more of a shrub thing than the mid canopy. But my message there is, if you look at, and I just drove out here through those residential areas, it's trees, grass with a few landscape shrubs against the house. There's no mid canopy.
Right.
In a lot. And if you look and start to look in most residential areas, you see they're really missing the mid canopy. That's where a lot of birds nest. It's where they seek cover. It's where they get fruit, if you're allowing the plant to fruit. So that's another, those 2 groups of pollinators and the birds seem to be ones that people.
That's what
take an
people
interest in.
are responding to.
Yeah.
So, as an educator, how do you engage people in thinking about the natural world and thinking about ecology as relevant to their lives?
Well, in part, it's opening their eyes, like you said, awareness, because people aren't aware, and yet every little corner, that awareness can be increased. By which I mean you could go out into the yard, I can go out onto campus, I can go out into natural areas, I can go into manicured landscapes, and just have people look at things they don't normally look at, and actually so that they see it. And so seeing is, I think, very important, opening people's, because you can talk, and I do talk, and I give talks all the time, but like especially working with students, talking is one thing, but experiencing and seeing and touching and feeling is another thing. And that experience, and we know that from the scientific studies, that experience is what really captivates people.
You need to immerse them.
They can actually get immersed or touch or see or have some kind of we'll call it hands-on experience. Greatly increases people's learning and their interest, because you don't learn really, you can learn through books, but you really learn through, for natural systems, you learn by observing and seeing and looking at the interactions. And that's, that for me has been rewarding with the students, is you open their eyes and you just realize, wow, I just opened that student's eyes and now they're going a whole new path with their life.
And now they see. Is there like a particular story that comes to mind of like, that moment with one of your students? And
well, I did get into honeybees for a little bit because the students wanted to have honeybees on campus, and and so we got some hives, and I started raising the honeybees, just, it was part of the Arboretum. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to have the honeybee hives, I could teach a class on honeybees, and then, the university get a little money from this tuition money, and we could engage them more. And so I taught these little classes, like 12, 15 students, and I've had 4 students in 5 years just from taking that one class that have gone on to get PhDs in honeybee biology. And I'm not even really a honeybee biologist, because they were exposed to that, and this whole world was opened up.
So y'all had hives?
We have like 3 or 4 hives on campus, and I taught a class and taught them all about honeybees. And then, the past few years we learned about honeybees, but then the project they do is to look at other pollinators on campus. And again, students who maybe aren't interested, don't look, I get them to look. You got to look at a tiny flower and a tiny bee, and suddenly this whole world opens up. Oh my gosh, I had no idea that was there. So those are some examples. of people have really been taken by things is the honeybees is just one example I can think of with my students. There have been other, when I was down at Buck Island Ranch, I had so many, down at Archbold, I had so many research interns would come through for 4 to 6 months and do projects. And I'd give them this opportunity to have experiments and do things, and some of those have gone on. One of them was Chris Wilson. He's now, just getting tenure up. He does kind of like a grazing systems ecology. Now he's looking at carbon storage and grazing lands in Florida, and so that's another example. We're having that kind of mentorship for a period of time. Basically contributes to somebody continuing along a career trajectory, which then they become a leader in that field. It's very rewarding to see that happen.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and it happened to me. I mean, it happened to me. There was a mentor somewhere who got me excited about things. So that's more from a student-mentor kind of, which for professors is an important relationship. For the general public, I think the same thing. You saw all the folks getting excited, including Gina down at Sunbridge, taking pictures of the bee killers in the plots. That people went in our plots and really started to see things, and that we pointed out that maybe they hadn't thought of before, and then it became important to them.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a priority for them.
My experience, my personal journey learning about native plant landscaping and learning more about ecosystems has been so rewarding.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I'm particularly unique, and I think it's just a kind of a natural human drive that I think we want to feel like we're connected to our environment and that our environment is healthy and safe.
Yeah.
And I expect that when people are exposed and immersed into these urban landscape systems that we're proposing, there's going to be overwhelmingly a positive response.
Yeah, I would think so. E.O. Wilson called it biophilia. I don't know if I totally bought into his theory on that, but I do think that people do have an inherent appreciation for the appreciating being interested in organisms like plants and animals. People are fascinated. People love butterflies, but even the ugly stuff. People see ugly bugs that are just look bizarre. Look at this fascinating thing. Beauty berries, the purple berries. People. His theory was people are inherently, because we evolved in these systems, we're connected to nature, that's kind of a built-in part of how our brains work. And you mentioned that earlier, just talking about our realization about how immersion in nature or access and connection to nature can contribute to both physical and mental health benefits, which again gets us back to urban systems where people might not have as much access. That's so key. And there was even a recent study, I think it was Germany or European study, that showed not only did green space matter, but they showed more positive benefit for more diverse systems. Mm-hmm. That going into a park with a lawn and trees was different than walking into a park that had a lot of biodiversity in it. And that kind of stands to reason. You have more to look at, more to feel, more sense of nature in a park that is supporting more kinds of ecosystems, more birds, more pollinators and that kind of a thing. So we're just scratching the surface on this understanding.
But that would be a really interesting kind of meta-analysis of the research that's already been done on the social and health benefits of natural systems, because there has been a lot done. I remember following some of that, and it seems like if we could bring all of that together and then have some sort of meta-analysis of just how comprehensive and wide, far-reaching, this research is suggesting that these effects may go. When we start viewing our urban landscapes as part of our healthcare system, it really shifts kind of the value paradigm.
It does. It's just something to think about. Healthy living. What does that now mean? Yeah. And it also means having a healthy relationship with the space that you live in, the natural space that you live in.
I saw there was some research on children with ADD. This was from University of Chicago. Children with ADD are able to focus better when they are in a natural environment or have a window with a view to a natural environment. Outpatient healthcare systems, they have faster recovery times and better outcomes when there's a view to green space. Test scores increase. The amount of time people will spend in a retail environment and also the amount of money they will spend in a retail environment is correlated to the quality of the green space.
Yeah, it's amazing.
There's been correlations with crime, community pride, on and on and on.
Yeah. It makes sense in a way. It's kind of intuitive, but there's a lot of people in the world that don't have access to it, and where it's been made less available, and then places in the world where it is available, and then that becomes the social justice and equity piece that a lot of people who don't have access, live in communities where they weren't developed that way. They don't have as much access. They're more impoverished. Orlando's actually a fairly good community in that it's a fairly green community. We have a pretty good tree canopy in Orlando. I think in part just the way the city was developed. But there's a lot of cities where there's a real lack of tree cover in certain parts of the city. And there's probably opportunities there to bring more in and create more spaces for people who wouldn't normally have access to them. And there's been work on that as well.
Yeah. I guess that's what the Outside Collaborative is really focused on, and you've been a founding member and a trustee of this young organization.
Yes.
We're sad to see you go. We'll talk about that in a moment. But in looking back on the last 5 years of the Outside Sustainable Landscape Collaborative, how would you summarize what its impact has been? And what its purpose is. On me or on the world? on the mission. Because I did want to say, or maybe on you. Well, you mentioned earlier about native plants, and as you've gotten into it, and it's opened your eyes up. It's like, well, I'm an ecologist, and I had a background in agroecology and forest ecology. I worked on a lot of different systems, soil ecology, primarily in some of these different ecosystems. Native plants and landscapes, it was totally new to me. When I came to UCF, I took over the landscape operation as part of my job. I didn't have any background in landscape horticulture, so it was fascinating to me from, I have my biological background, so I could kind of handle the horticultural side pretty easily. But then getting into outside and discovering the same connections, my eyes were being open too. I didn't know much about these interactions, at the landscape level, native plants, Doug Tallamy's ideas. We basically immersed ourselves in those same kinds of ideas. So that's been a great boon to me. I do think that outside, as a collaborative, I think the proof is in the pudding as far as the impact it's having. I think the conferences, we've organized in Cherry Lake, your leadership's been obviously key. There'd be no outside without Tim Sallin at this point. Let's be honest about that. But the conferences have been great. I think they've had an impact, and that. Even county commissioners have come to those meetings and asked us to come speak at the county commission. They get excited about these ideas when they hear about them. And then this realization that you're not going to have the impact that you want to have, or it's going to be harder to have the impact of the broad scale application or incorporation of these ideas if you don't bring in the people who are developing these new areas like Sunbridge. And so that that's through serendipity or through whatever efforts with Pierce Jones and whatnot to get involved with Sunbridge. You've seen now Sunbridge is going this new direction. They're pushing it even farther. The folks that are on board with it down there are basically building a community that's very much like other residential communities in terms of the homes and the roads and the other things, but they're taking this approach to landscape that's going to be transformational. And then we have other developers that are coming on board that are developing large communities that are doing that. And I think that's not the only sign that outside's having an impact, but it clearly shows that the little collaborative that 5 or 10 people pulled together 5 years ago is really gone way beyond maybe where we thought it would be in 5 years. I don't know what your views are on that. It's far exceeded my expectations, to be honest. And I don't attribute that particularly to the work of the collaborative itself, although it has been important. I think it's an idea whose time has come. There's a real kind of alignment in terms of stakeholder needs and interests. That where water is important, where water quality is important, and beyond that, I think these issues about biodiversity and community engagement, creating true communities and places where people feel connected, those are values that are fairly present in our state. You know, from across a broad range of stakeholders, from the county commissioners to the developers to the residents. You know, to the academia and industry. So because of that alignment, there's momentum, and I think it's great. I'm just so excited about what we're doing and the impact that it potentially will have.
It's amazing. No, it's been great, and certainly for me, one of the most rewarding things I've been involved with in the past 5 years professionally. I'm a professor. I teach my classes. I do my research, but some of my research has been supported by the collaborative, and that's been fantastic. And then just a lot of people don't get a chance to work in a truly collaborative, interdisciplinary way. Sometimes interdisciplinary for a scientist means I'm working with another scientist who's interested in another aspect of science that we can connect on. But translational ecology requires that you are interacting with completely different players who are outside the academic realm altogether. Which people like yourself, who's a producer and a landscape company, people like Chris Height, involved in the landscape architecture angle of things and the landscape design, the developer, ultimately coming down to the builders. There all these different. That's really where you get into the transdisciplinary work. Is going beyond just having different disciplines work together. It's kind of going beyond the disciplines by involving all of these different sectors and communities. And that in my experiences, that's in my career I've had a couple of instances of that. That's where you have real transformational impact on, what's actually happening on the ground, or from programmatically what has a big impact, is when you bring together partnerships like that.
Yeah, that was really exciting. And there's especially the research component, because it was, like you say, it was in the field, it was in partnership with industry and across a large section of stakeholders. And I think the research is really good. I think the findings, were really helpful with regarding to the plant pollinator relationships, the kind of this ground up soil effect when you guys were looking at the compost impact.
Oh yeah.
On pollinators and now the water data that's coming out of the research. It's really actionable. I think it's the kind of research that will move industries. And that will lead to change, and that's, I'm sure, very rewarding for you guys doing the research.
Sure.
And for us in industry, it's super important to have that kind of information.
Yeah, to have the backup, or at least the
validation,
credibility, the
credibility
of the system. Yeah, exactly.
And it was also cool that it was a partnership between researchers from UCF and UF.
Yes, and I think the developer in part was really not insistent upon that, but interested in that, because UCF is the homegrown institution, and they wanted to have some involvement there. And if I hadn't been there, I don't know if they would have succeeded, because I just happened to be this person there who had run the landscape, who had some credibility from the landscape perspective. So it was that was another kind of alignment that happened there.
Yeah,
it was just perfect.
That's right.
And Pierce Jones took the lead on connecting with me and getting me involved, which I really appreciate. And again, Pierce is another. Pierce was a transformer. He wants to change the world and drive people to new places. And so I wanted to give him credit on the contribution he made to bringing us all together as well. But yeah, it's just it's been a great journey from the start, and I've gotten so much out of it, and I'm going to miss it. But hopefully maybe can stay involved to some degree. We'll see.
Yes. Let's talk about where you're going, because, you must be so excited.
I am. It's a mixture of excitement and dread of having to move that far. But yeah, I am very excited, and I'm learning more and more about the position and where I'm going, and it's going to be not only a fun, but a very rewarding job, and I'm honored to have been selected to have it. So yeah.
So tell us what this position is.
Well, I was director of the Arboretum, as you know, at UCF, and that's a nice program. It's a relatively small program. We had a few staff, really a lot of student involvement, because we didn't have a lot of staff. So we had this great leadership program that we developed there. And now it's the Arboretum Sustainability Initiatives. It's like a solid piece of campus right now. So I had the background and interest in Arboreta, University Arboreta, and I saw an opportunity pop up at University of Wisconsin. And the thing about Arboreta in general, but if people even know what an arboretum is, it tends to be a collection of trees and woody plants. And so people have a view in their head of what an arboretum is, but I happen to have known, because I knew a little bit about the history of it, that the UW Arboretum is a different kind of an animal. The UW Arboretum, University of Wisconsin Arboretum, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, just a couple miles from campus, goes back to the 1930s. And the first director was Aldo Leopold, who we discussed earlier, who wrote The Land Ethic. They do have the state's most outstanding woody plant collection. It's on 350 acres, but the rest of the 1,200 acres is really a restoration landscape. And they did the first prairie restoration that anybody ever did in the world there, starting in the 1930s, where they just went out to these remnant prairies. Prairies are just destroyed throughout the Midwest, and they weren't like forests where you kept examples of them. They just plowed them all. But there were these little remnants, and some of the ecologists at the time realized this incredible system is disappearing. So the folks at the Arboretum, it wasn't just professors and academics, there were people in facilities. There was a local guy, Michael Ulbricht, who has a botanical garden named after him in town, was just wanted to have an arboretum. He knew the people at Harvard Arboretum, and at Harvard, the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard, and they just wanted their own arboretum. So they built this thing, but it was much more built around this idea of managing the landscape for ecological systems and restoration. So they still have this beautiful prairie that they restored, first prairie restoration in the world, the 60-acre prairie that's just phenomenal that's there, and then a lot of woodlands and different habitats they created. And then so it's really grown into quite a system. They've got an education program, great administrative staff, land managers, and land care is such a big part of it. So there's a land management team that manages all this land. They're very involved in the community. They're very involved with conservation issues throughout southeastern Wisconsin and beyond. And they do continue to support research. There's a lot of graduate research going on there, and one of the expectations for me is that I'll carry on and keep research going on there. So it's really just I don't know what to say, it's just a phenomenal place. It's a great opportunity. I just spoke to the previous director, who's still there in town, and she loved the job and was so excited about me coming there and assuring me how great it's going to be. So just a great opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to it, because that aspect of restoration and ecological, connecting people with nature is just what that whole organization is all about. It's very well known in the community. A lot of hundreds of thousands of visitors a year just coming and using the trails and riding their bikes up there. So it's really kind of a neat spot, and that's what I'm going to go be director of that.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah.
It's a very prestigious post, and in the world of ecology and conservation and restoration, natural lands management, I understand it's really kind of a mecca.
It is, and the other thing though, it is one of the things is they do have the native landscape is kind of a thing, because people are saying, well, how can I have some of this in my own space, like we talked about? And so there is an interest in one of the staff members there, Susan Carpenter. She is a native plant specialist. She holds workshops, if you want to plant native plants in your yard, what to do, how to do it, that kind of a thing. And they have a 4-acre native plant garden around the building. Mm-hmm. That is really a lot of tall grass prairie. And this year they had so much rain. I was up there when I bought my house. The tall grass prairie there, it gets like 7 to 8 feet tall, the grasses. And then all the wildflowers. And they have wildflowers. We have yucca, rattlesnake master, goes all the way up there. So they have some of the plants we have, which is kind of interesting to think that far north that plant has that span. But so they do have some interaction with that, the community aspect of getting native plants incorporated. But one thing I noticed driving around Madison, which is kind of a progressive college town, it's also the state capital. Even my wife could not believe, as we're driving around town, you're downtown and the median is 4-foot tall wildflowers all the way for a mile. The local community center in our little suburb that we live in, the whole frontage of it is just native wildflowers, 6-foot native wildflowers. In part, there's native prairie there. So I don't know if they planted all this or it's just the remnant streets, but clearly the medians were planted. So there's a pretty strong community ethic there for conservation and things like that you feel when you just drive around, because it's like ever present. It's kind of cool in some of these areas. Yeah.
Well, that's exciting.
Yeah.
I hope to come visit you up there.
Yeah, that'd be great. Oh, and I was going to say also, just a little side story, was the person who originally designed the original native landscape at the Arboretum in front of the building. His name's Daryl Morrison. He's a landscape architect. I don't know if he was at Wisconsin at the time or he came from somewhere else, but he designed the original, and he came back this summer apparently just to see it. He lives in New York City now, but where it's gone and how it's become. And Chris Height was at UGA getting her degree in landscape architecture, and he was a professor there, or taught a class there, and he told them about this native landscape that he designed at the UW Arboretum, so she knew about it.
Yeah.
And she said, oh, one of my professors, Daryl Morrison, designed the native landscape there. And I said, it's funny how things kind of circle around and connect. She said, yeah, you got to come up sometime and see it.
That's great, and maybe maybe one day you'll have an outside collaborative in Wisconsin.
We'll form something like that. Yeah, there are a lot of conservation groups. I'm interested to see how all the Florida, the native plant people interact and how that works there. But there's a lot of interest in it. Definitely a lot of interest in people planting their little wildflower patches in their yard and whatnot. And they've got, just think of all the things we've got. It's like cognate species. They've got their, it's not rosinweed, but it's rosinweed's relative, and the kind of things that we focus on. They have a lot of that up there. And then they have a whole new suite of things that we just don't have in the subtropics down here.
Yeah, a bunch of different types of grasses.
Yeah, I grew up there in Ohio, and I went to University of Michigan, so it's like I'm familiar with all of that plant, not totally, but familiar with those plant communities that we just don't have here, So I have some familiarity with the oaks and the red oaks and the white oaks, and it's kind of going back to an ecosystems that I was more familiar with earlier in my life.
How long have you been in Florida?
Well, I've been in Florida for 26 years,
and
I love Florida and the ecosystems in Florida and everything. So that, I'm going to miss things about Florida for sure, because this is a great state for preservation of land. Florida's done a great job, and they're working to do more. Not every state has this much land locked up in conservation like we do in Florida. Up against, as you know, the massive development that's going on, we do have a pretty good legacy of nature conservation in Florida. The wildlife corridor, it's been supported by both sides of the aisle in the legislature. Not present in every state. Yeah,
Florida is a complex and interesting place.
Yeah.
Sure. Reflecting on your time in Florida, can you say what maybe is unique about our ecosystems and the specific challenges that we're facing with regards to our natural environment?
Yeah, I think one of the things about Florida is that, well, number one, it's, most of our systems that we need to preserve are fire driven, so there's a need to keep fire as an important part of managing them. But the other thing about Florida is we have a lot of endemism. We have a lot of species that exist only here. So there is a pretty high level of biodiversity that's either only in Florida or only in the southeastern U.S. that is under threat because of this massive, development with 1 million people. I think 1 million people moved to Florida last year net or something like that. That really puts pressure on a part of the world, this Florida Peninsula, that has a very rich diversity that is endemic to this region, and that does present certain challenges. The other thing, whether it's a challenge or not, Florida it's coastal. It's all coastal. So you've got everything from uplands to coast everywhere you go. So the variety of ecosystems that are in Florida and the dominance of lakes and wetlands is just, fascinating. It's a fascinating ecological place. I think ecologists in general love to be in Florida because of the richness of the ecological systems here. And there's a more rarity. Like if you go to the Midwest where I'm going, there are rare species, yes, but not like in Florida. There aren't as many rare and interesting habitats. Yes, there are diminished habitats, but Florida's really interesting from the level of diversity just in habitat types that it has.
I've heard Florida described as a biodiversity hotspot.
Yes.
Is that a thing? Like, what does that mean?
So a biodiversity hotspot, it does have a definition, and I'm going to probably screw it up, but Reed Noss, who was a conservation biologist in our department, was involved in making, and it wasn't just Florida, it's pretty much the southeastern coastal plain has been designated a biodiversity hotspot. You have to have a certain amount of plant diversity in the region. I think it's 1,500 species that are endemic to the region, meaning that they're here,
only there,
nowhere else. And then you have to have high development pressure. So you could have a biodiversity rich region that's not a hot spot because it's not under threat. So to be a biodiversity hotspot, you not only have to have a lot of biodiversity, it has to be under the threat of development. I think it's like up to 70% developed, meaning
Wow.
you've only got 30% left of the landscape, and then you know, so
It's like a red flag.
it's a red flag. It's more of a, you know, we really have to work in this region to maintain that biodiversity. Those, I think, are the two criteria. I mean, don't quote me on that, but I think those are the two main criteria are, you know, the 1,500 native plants, and of course, imagine all the animals that go with that. But that's like one of the criteria, and then that it's got this, you know, threat of development. So, yeah,
that seems about right.
Yeah,
that feels like Florida.
Yeah, and the southeastern coastal plain is a very unique and very fascinating place. And then, of course, our flatwoods used to be 90 million acres, and now it's, you know, one of the most reduced. It's like the tall grass prairie almost. There's 3% left. And so there's been a move in the federal government and restore, and there are groups that are working on it here in Florida and other southeastern states. So it's encouraging to see that the federal government is working cooperatively with states to try to restore more longleaf pine, which should have been the basic matrix for the entire southeast, and it's the source of so many of these.
And that's
pollinators.
been logged to near extinction.
Logged to near extinction, yeah. It was originally logged just for the lumber, and then I think around World War I or that era, they logged them for the kerosene as a fuel for the warships and things like that. That really accelerated it. And then, you know, it's a fire-dominated system, so you can eliminate that from the landscape. You don't have the fires, you can farm it, you can put a city on it. So it's just one of those ecosystems that required these dynamics of fire and that humans don't tend to, especially when the landscape.
It was inconvenient.
It's inconvenient. We suppress fires. We don't want fires, and then they kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater because that was required to have this incredible diversity and these cool species that we have here. But you know, it's encouraging to see there's so much emphasis and support on trying to restore longleaf systems and get them back on the landscape.
But how serious is the crisis in biodiversity decline, not just in Florida but globally? Like, how concerned should we be about insect populations and biodiversity in general?
Well, you know, it gets back to what we talked about earlier. I do think systems are resilient. I also think that some of it's definitely true. We have the data to show the biodiversity decline, but there's also some bounce back stories of species, and part of it's due to human intervention. Are we going to lose species? That's kind of inevitable, I think, but can we take actions that actually keep them on the landscape? I think so. Back when I was a kid, you know, we worried about whales, save the polar bears, and you know, now we have, I mean, the Endangered Species Act, the bald eagle, you know, these big charismatic, and now we have 9 bumblebees on the endangered species list. You wouldn't even thought 50 years ago we're going to have bees on the endangered species list. So that opens up our eyes to the need to have these habitats on the landscape. And the reason all these things are disappearing is we've wiped out the systems, those interdependencies that they require, which brings us back to the land ethic. You've got to keep all the pieces, and the only way you keep all the pieces is to keep some examples of intact systems and connect them to one another, and then we can, without hurting our economy and without destroying our farming and without limiting a lot of what we do in our lives, can actually sustain these species into the future. So it is a crisis, and it's going to require that we change what we're doing, or we will lose a lot of these species.
Yeah, the data is alarming. I can't remember statistics very well, but I've gone online and I've read.
Yeah, the number of...
It's a tough moment, like, of realization to read those numbers. You're like, wow, this is a big deal.
It is real, yeah. And I do think there's hope, but I do think it requires that we act on the knowledge that we have to take the necessary actions to either reverse or slow down the loss. And I do think it, in a lot of it, certainly in the terrestrial realm, I mean, on land, it's very much habitat. We've got to restore the habitats or get examples of the habitats there. And then in the water, you know, things like coral reefs, well, that's a difficult issue because it has to do with the temperature and acidification of the ocean and things like that. We may lose some systems that way, but yeah, I don't like to be the alarmist crisis kind of person. I just like to be aware.
Yeah.
I think we should be aware that biodiversity is under threat from human development and expansion, and then we should use that knowledge as a prompt for us to do something about it, and as best we can to try to restore it. And a lot of that has to get back to what you talked about earlier, which is making people more aware.
Yeah, we need to face the facts, but we can't get discouraged by them either, because there is this story of resilience in nature. When you bring in a native plant and then the pollinator somehow magically shows up, and if you do that on any kind of scale, rewilding your yard, as simple as that may seem, it's the thing that most people own.
Yeah.
Right? It's the piece of land that most people have a say over what happens.
Exactly.
And your yard matters.
Mm-hmm.
And if you connect all of the yards, it's actually far more land that we could ever conserve.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, if people suddenly became aware of that, I think there should be real inroads. I don't know what it's going to take, and there are the efforts of Doug telling me and outside and things like that. One certainly hopes that it takes off like wildfire, right? But the other thing we have going on is climate change, and they interact. They're not independent. I was just looking at a map yesterday of how they're expecting prime crop regions to shift just in the U.S. And under just the moderate scenario, you know, the Corn Belt is going to move north a little bit. Texas is going to be much harder to grow a lot of the crops that they're currently growing, because they're going to get really hot and probably dry. So you have to also accept that the world might change, and that has to be part of our approach to how we adapt to it. Is in the place you are, the climate might change and the players might change a little bit. You might have new mix of species, but wherever you are, you're making that effort to restore and maintain, you know, as much of the natural community, as much of the biotic integrity as you can. And that's where accepting kind of the dynamic equilibrium that things are constantly changing is important. And just because things are changing doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make an effort to improve our relationship with the biotic community, and, you know, make sure we retain as many players as we can. I think that was another Aldo Leopold thing. One of his other great quotes was, and I'm going to paraphrase because it's, you know, one of the first hallmarks of good tinkering is that you keep all the parts. So, and we've tinkered a lot with nature, but you don't want to lose your
You don't want to
cogs and
lose
your
too many
wheels
things.
and come back and you try to put it together. It's like, well, we're missing pieces. So, you know, that's a great message too. Is we need to keep all the parts as best we can, given the understanding that the world is changing and that we are going to have impact on it. And I'm hopeful, just because of the number of people committed to that and the number of things you see happening on the ground everywhere you go. Even I think of Europe. Europe's got more wolves than we do. You know, they've got a lot of rewilding going on because, again, agriculture is very productive. A lot of the other areas have become forested again, and, you know, there are these cycles you go through, and they're introducing beavers to Scotland or something. You know, these things are happening, which is kind of neat to see.
It is kind of neat,
yeah.
And it can happen quickly, and it's a fun movement to be a part of. And I think it is important to be engaged, to first be aware, and ultimately to care. And I think that gets to the ethics,
Yeah.
and that we were talking about at the very beginning. That our values matter because it drives our behaviors, and we need to, I believe, you know, come to this kind of collective understanding that we have a responsibility to steward the environment. There is no wild place without human impacts anymore, or if there are, it's maybe in the poles and in a very few rare places on Earth. But human beings are part of ecology, and we have an outsized role and responsibility. And that doesn't mean that it has to burden us with, you know, we don't have to sacrifice quality of life or wealth or health or any of those things. In fact, I kind of believe they go hand in hand. The healthier our ecology is, then the healthier and wealthier our societies will be. I think that's almost a tautology.
I think they do I do think so too, because especially if you look at where degradation is, it's always where there's either civil unrest or complete breakdown, you know, or just where people don't have a say. That's where you really see that kind of environmental degradation. And the other thing I think is helping people see the connections, because I don't think a lot of people make connections between like what they're doing in the yard and like downstream nutrient problems, maybe in waterways, and or what they're doing in their yards and biodiversity loss and what could be accomplished there. So
I think that's what I'm most interested in in learning about and hopefully one day becoming skillful at is helping to make these connections like we were talking about, to get people to start to see it, and then it takes them down a path that nobody could have anticipated. That might be the single most powerful thing that we can do, because it leverages the entire human being from that point forward. And it might be as simple as showing a parent or a child, you know, a plant-pollinator relationship, or pointing out, you know, why that bluebird is present, and it has to do with the mid-story plant.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm struggling with the how to tell those stories. I hope that, like I said, I hope that I get better at it.
You're pretty good at it.
and because I think that's where the magic is. You know, I mean, like, obviously the science is super important. All the stuff we're doing with farming and like landscape industry and, you know, outside, like, it's all very, very important. I love it. But somehow, like, it doesn't seem as impactful of just that simple moment of connection.
Yes.
That immersive moment of connection.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's where you can maybe change somebody's life.
Yeah.
Yep.
We're all working towards it. I think we have to be humble, because, you know, it involves all of us, and there's nothing that we can do on our own. But it's been a real inspiration for me to work alongside you. I'm honored to have collaborated with you, and I've learned a lot, not just today, but, you know, I think it's been 5 or 6 years, and
yeah, it's amazing.
I'm very grateful to you for the time you've invested in me.
Well, I appreciate it in part because, you know, I'm Cam. I'm pretty good at that storytelling on nature bits and whatnot. But you've been a great visionary on the landscape part and how you need to transform to more sustainable landscape, and you're just so good at getting in front of people and articulating that. I don't know many people who have done it as well as you've done it, you know, as part of this group and as part of what's going on in Florida right now, and that's a real talent. And the drive to be transformational and really make the changes, it takes a person like you. So it's been an honor for me to work with you. I'll miss working as closely with you as I have, and I really do appreciate the time we've had together.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick.
Yeah, it's been great.